My name is Chandran Nair. I work for the Global Institute of Tomorrow, which I call a Think to Do tank based in Asia. Well, I think the most important the most difficult challenge we have is actually framing the discussion. And for me, much of that framing requires greater intellectual honesty. And thus, I try and bring to it a discussion that starts to get people to frame the discussion in ways that get them to understand that perhaps notions like liberal democracy, free markets, and technology are not the panaceas that they think they are. So it's that honest intellectual inquiry that I think is the most important starting point. Well, with regard to liberal democracy, my opinion is that we have to be very careful about suggesting that the rest of the world should adopt Western liberal democratic traditions. By that, I don't mean that they should, the opposite of authoritarian states is the answer. Coming from an Asian perspective, my view is that we live in very different times in the 21st century. And with the constraints that we have in the 21st century, we ought to redefine, therefore, what freedoms are, what rights are, etc., given that the majority of people in Asia are disenfranchised with the basic rights to live, which is water, sanitation, food, etc. And suggesting that liberal democracy will deliver all of that is a lie. Well, the solution clearly is a very clear understanding of what the state needs to deliver in terms of the rights of the citizens. So if you look at countries like India, etc., I think it'd be fair to say, and I think most Indians will agree with me, that the state has failed to provide that basic right, that security that the citizens require. And the belief at the moment in the Indian democratic tradition that liberal democracy somehow over a period of time will deliver all of that, well, the evidence is very clear it does not. So the state's role, which I call the strong state, be it the democratic state or the non-democratic state, is to provide those basic rights to live, which is for me the most fundamental human rights, which in my view precede the freedom of speech issue, which is of course the sacred cow in the West. Yeah, I mean, clearly you can't argue against the need to bring a diverse group of people together. That's clearly very important. But more importantly is how do we frame the discussions, what we seek to get out of it. And I think we should not shy away from having rather controversial discussions, and as I've referred to before, having that intellectual honesty. I think that's one of the rarest commodities today in most forums, and at Salzburg I've been pleased to see that there's been an openness to engage in greater intellectual honesty. And that's really the great benefit of bringing people, the more diverse, clearly, the better. There is a view that the Asian consumer will essentially help restore the global economy. Post-2008 financial crisis, the world looked to Asia to consume more. The fact is that out of about 4 billion people in Asia, the consuming classes are only about 700 million at the most. That's about 20% of the entire Asian population. 700 million Asians consuming and joining the ranks of the world's consuming classes, but at a lower per capita consumption level, has already rocked the world. The impact of China, etc., has all been based on the Asian consumption model feeding the global economy. The projections are, among some, that 1 billion Asians will join the consuming ranks in the next 10 years. I believe this will be catastrophic unless we change the paradigm about what we mean by consumption and the pricing of consumption, and particularly how Asian governments respond to who can have what. So my view is we should not adopt the Western consumption-led economic model. It'll be catastrophic for Asia and the world. I mean, all I've argued for is that we need a new narrative. Much of the narrative has been based on the Western experience. It has delivered much goodness to the world, but I believe the 21st century is very different for a whole host of reasons. But if you accept that the planet is going to be constrained, given that there are going to be 10 billion people by 2050, the most populated part of the region is going to be my neighborhood. 6 billion. We will need a new narrative. Having been subservient for 2-3 centuries, we now want to say, hey, we can be like you and it will be better. This will be catastrophic. So all I've tried to do is say, here's a new narrative. And that new narrative says, ultimately, in a crowded place, we will need to have rules. Rules are not made by NGOs or multinational companies or civil societies. They are made by the institutions of our state. Our obligation as citizens of that crowded part of the world is to ensure our governments are both fair, transparent, etc., but we do not seek, because we have the luxury that is underpins liberal democracy, to undermine the state every day of the week. That would be lighting a match in a forest with a lot of dry leaves. And so I'm asking that a strong state could be democratic, but nations will decide. And the ideological struggle of the 21st century will be the struggle within the Western world to suggest to the rest, you can be like us, because they can't say otherwise. And their economic model depends on now these vast amount of consumers from Asia buying their products. But what the Western world doesn't see is that if 6 billion Asians try to consume like them, they will not only destroy themselves, they'll destroy the world. And that is what I'm asking us to think very carefully about.